Hi guys, the night air above the Nile River was still warm, even after the sun had long disappeared behind the dark western desert. Soft water moved against the muddy riverbanks with a slow and gentle sound. Somewhere far away, a dog barked once and then became quiet again. Thin reeds bent softly beside the water. A fishing boat rocked lazily against a wooden post driven deep into the wet earth. In the sleeping villages along the river, most fires had already faded into red ash. The smell of baked bread still lingered faintly in the narrow streets between mud brick homes. Sandals rested beside doorways. Clay jars cooled in the darkness. Workers who had spent the long day beneath the heavy Egyptian sun now slept on woven mats under open windows where the night breeze could enter. The stars above ancient Egypt were bright and endless. And beneath those stars, the great system of Egypt continued quietly through the centuries. Empires in other lands often rose quickly and vanished just as fast. Cities burned. Kingdoms broke apart. Armies marched across dry plains and disappeared into dust. But Egypt moved differently. Slowly. Carefully. Like the steady rhythm of the Nile itself. The kingdom bent many times, but it rarely shattered completely. Its people woke each morning to familiar routines. Farmers walked to the fields before sunrise. Bakers prepared dough in dim kitchens lit by oil lamps. Scribes unrolled sheets of papyrus while rubbing tired eyes. Boatmen pushed long wooden poles into river mud and guided heavy boats through calm water. Life continued. And because life continued, Egypt endured. Long before the pyramids became old, before temples rose beside the Nile in white stone, before travelers crossed hot desert roads carrying copper and incense, the river had already shaped the lives of the people who lived beside it. The Nile was not simply water. It was time itself. Each year the river rose slowly. Dark floodwaters spread across the land and covered the dry soil with rich black mud. Villagers watched carefully as the waters climbed higher against carved river markers. Farmers spoke quietly together about the flood level while standing barefoot at the edge of the fields. Too little water meant hunger. Too much water meant ruined homes and drowned animals. But most years the flood came gently enough. The river spread life across the land and then slowly retreated again beneath the warm Egyptian sun. Afterward, the fields became soft and dark and ready for planting. This cycle almost never changed. And because it almost never changed, the people of Egypt learned to trust it deeply. In the early morning darkness, before the first light touched the eastern sky, farmers already stirred awake inside their homes. Thin blankets were folded carefully. Children slept beside parents in crowded rooms where the air smelled faintly of smoke, sweat, and dry reeds. Outside, donkeys shifted slowly in small fenced yards. A mother knelt beside a clay oven and prepared coarse bread from barley flour. The dough was rough beneath her hands. Sometimes sand from the grinding stones remained inside the bread itself, slowly wearing down teeth over many years. But hunger was stronger than discomfort. The oven glowed softly. The village remained quiet. Soon the men would leave for the fields. Many wore only simple linen cloth around the waist during the hottest months. Sandals slapped gently against dusty roads as workers walked together beneath fading stars. They carried wooden hoes over their shoulders. Some led oxen toward the wet farmland near the riverbanks. Above them, the sky slowly brightened from black to deep blue. Birds moved across the reeds. The first sunlight touched the Nile. This was how Egypt survived century after century. Not through constant war or endless conquest, but through repetition. Through habit. Through millions of ordinary mornings that looked almost exactly like the mornings before them. The kingdom depended on people who rarely appeared in royal carvings. A fisherman standing knee-deep in shallow water before dawn. A tired woman carrying jars from the river. A laborer repairing irrigation walls beneath crushing afternoon heat. A scribe counting grain deliveries inside a crowded storage house. These people held Egypt together more firmly than armies often did. The rulers of Egypt understood this, even if quietly. Pharaohs rose and fell across the centuries. Some built enormous monuments. Others disappeared almost completely from memory. Yet the deeper structure of Egyptian life remained steady beneath them all. The fields still needed planting. Bread still needed baking. Boats still moved along the Nile. Taxes still needed collecting. The great machine of Egypt was built from routines. And routines are difficult to destroy. Far south along the Nile, beyond crowded cities and temple walls, workers cut stone from massive quarries under the burning sun. The sound of hammering echoed across pale cliffs. Dust floated constantly through the dry air. Men wrapped cloth around their heads to protect themselves from heat and flying stone fragments. The labor was slow and exhausting. Water carriers walked carefully between groups of workers with heavy jars balanced against their shoulders. Sweat darkened linen clothing. Muscles ached. Hands blistered and hardened. Yet even here, far from royal palaces, the same steady rhythm appeared again. Meals arrived at predictable hours. Stone was measured carefully. Scribes recorded supplies with patient attention. Supervisors checked work progress beneath shaded shelters. At night the workers rested together in simple housing near the quarry. Some spoke quietly beside small cooking fires. Others rubbed oil into sore shoulders and legs before sleep. The desert cooled slowly after sunset. Warm winds carried sand across the ground. Then morning returned. And the work continued again. This was one reason Egypt rarely collapsed completely. Its systems reached into daily life so deeply that people continued following them almost automatically. Even during difficult times, the habits remained alive. A farmer still understood irrigation. A baker still understood grain storage. A boat captain still understood river currents. Knowledge passed gently from parent to child over generations like the slow passing of river water. In many parts of the world, rulers depended heavily on sudden military victories or unstable trade routes. But Egypt possessed something quieter and more dependable. Predictability. The Nile gave the kingdom a natural heartbeat. And the people shaped their entire lives around that heartbeat. During flood season, when fields disappeared beneath water, many farming workers turned toward state labor projects instead. Some repaired canals. Others transported stone or worked on royal construction sites. Entire villages could temporarily shift from farming to labor service without completely disrupting life. The government relied on this flexibility. Workers arrived in large groups carrying tools, baskets, and simple bedding. Officials organized crews carefully. Bread and beer rations were distributed each day. Scribes counted workers and recorded absences with careful brush strokes on papyrus sheets. The beer was thick and cloudy, more nourishing than modern beer. It filled stomachs during long workdays beneath the hot sky. Bread, onions, and dried fish often completed the simple meals. At midday, laborers rested briefly in narrow patches of shade beside unfinished walls or stacked stone blocks. Faces glistened with sweat. Dust coated skin and hair. Some men closed their eyes for a few quiet moments before returning to work. Nearby, donkeys brayed impatiently under heavy loads. Wooden sledges creaked across packed earth. The sound of Egypt was often the sound of labor. Not dramatic labor. Not heroic labor. Simply endless human effort repeated day after day beneath the sun. And somehow, from this repetition, stability emerged. Even religion in Egypt encouraged continuity more than sudden change. The gods themselves were deeply connected to cycles. The rising sun, the flooding river, the return of seasons, the movement of stars across the night sky. Order mattered greatly. The Egyptians called this balance ma'at. It was more than law, more than fairness. It was the idea that the world functioned correctly when everything remained in proper balance. Crops grew. Rivers flooded properly. Families worked. Temples performed rituals. Kings ruled responsibly. Chaos frightened people because chaos threatened the delicate rhythm of daily life. So much of Egyptian society became focused on preserving stability. Priests woke before sunrise inside temple complexes where stone floors still held the coolness of night. Oil lamps flickered softly along painted walls. Incense smoke drifted upward toward carved ceilings hidden in darkness. The priests washed carefully before rituals. Sacred statues were cleaned and dressed. Offerings of bread, beer, vegetables, and meat were placed before the gods each morning with calm repetition. Outside the temple walls, ordinary people were already beginning another workday. Children carried baskets. Merchants opened storage rooms. Potters shaped wet clay beside spinning wheels. Life unfolded in layers of familiar movement. And because these layers connected so tightly together, Egypt could survive enormous strain without completely falling apart. Even when weak rulers appeared, local officials often continued functioning. Even when invasions happened, villages still planted crops. Even when dynasties changed, the Nile still flooded. The deeper system remained alive beneath political troubles. In the crowded workshops of Memphis or Thebes, craftsmen worked patiently beneath open roofs where sunlight filtered through hanging cloth screens. The air smelled of wood dust, melted metal, paint, and sweat. Goldsmiths bent carefully over delicate jewelry. Carpenters smoothed rough boards with bronze tools. Leather workers stitched sandals beside piles of cured animal hides. Stone carvers tapped slowly at statues that would stand silently for centuries. Many craftsmen belonged to families that had practiced the same trade for generations. Skills passed quietly from father to son, mother to daughter. The motions became deeply familiar. Hands learned patterns that required little thought. This mattered more than kings sometimes realized. A civilization becomes durable when ordinary people know exactly how to continue life even during uncertainty. And Egypt was filled with people who understood continuation. At sunset, when the heat finally softened, the streets slowly filled again with quieter movement. Workers returned home tired and dusty. Some stopped beside small market stalls where onions, dates, fish, and bread were still being sold in fading golden light. Children played near the riverbanks while older women spoke softly together outside doorways. Smoke rose into the evening sky. Boats drifted lazily across darkening water. Then night slowly settled once more over the kingdom. Inside homes, families ate simple meals from shared bowls. Oil lamps flickered against mud brick walls. Bodies ached pleasantly after long work. Some people slept on rooftops during the hottest months where cooler night air moved gently across the skin. Above them all, the stars watched silently. Generations passed this way. One family replaced another. One ruler replaced another. But the rhythm remained. And this rhythm protected Egypt from sudden collapse again and again. Farther north, where the Nile spread into many branches near the great delta marshes, fishermen rose long before dawn and pushed small boats into dark water covered with mist. Nets rested in damp piles beneath their feet. Frogs croaked softly among thick reeds. The delta felt different from the dry southern regions. The air was heavier. Birdsong filled the wetlands each morning. Fish moved through tangled waterways that seemed endless beneath pale early sunlight. Fishing communities lived closely with uncertainty. Storms could overturn small boats. Crocodiles lurked silently near muddy banks. Disease spread easily in wet conditions. But even here, familiar systems guided life. Fish were salted and dried carefully. Boats were repaired using traditional methods. Trade routes connected marsh villages to larger cities. Taxes were collected. Records were kept. The kingdom stretched across many landscapes, yet the same quiet structure tied everything together. The scribes understood this perhaps better than anyone. Inside administrative buildings where the air smelled faintly of ink and papyrus fibers, scribes spent endless hours recording grain deliveries, labor assignments, tax collections, land measurements, and food storage levels. Their work was calm but extremely important. Egypt depended on counting. Counting grain. Counting workers. Counting livestock. Counting river levels. Without these records, the kingdom could not organize itself across such vast distances. Young apprentice scribes spent years learning symbols and careful handwriting. Many came from families connected to administration already. They sat cross-legged beside teachers while practicing signs repeatedly on broken pottery fragments or wooden boards. Their fingers darkened with ink. Their backs ached from long hours bent forward. Outside, laborers sweated beneath the sun. Inside, scribes sweated quietly over numbers and lists. Both kinds of work mattered equally. Because Egypt survived not through force alone, but through administration. Through patient organization repeated over centuries. When food shortages happened, officials sometimes redistributed grain from storage houses. When canals needed repair, labor crews could be assembled. When floods failed, records helped track remaining supplies. The system was never perfect. People still suffered terribly during certain periods. There were famines, corruption, political struggles, heavy taxation, exhaustion. But the structure itself remained surprisingly resilient. Part of this resilience came from geography itself. The desert protected Egypt on both sides like enormous silent walls. Invading armies faced harsh conditions before even reaching the fertile river valley. Long stretches of empty sand discouraged constant attacks. Meanwhile, the Nile served as a natural highway connecting the kingdom from south to north. Boats could carry grain, stone, workers, soldiers, messages, and supplies efficiently through the narrow green ribbon of fertile land. The river united Egypt physically. And over time, shared routines united it culturally. People across the kingdom prayed in similar ways. Farmed similarly. Built homes similarly. Buried their dead with similar hopes for the afterlife. This deep cultural continuity made sudden collapse less likely. Even when central authority weakened, ordinary life often continued beneath the surface. A farmer still woke before dawn. A woman still ground grain into flour. A child still carried water jars from the river. A fisherman still checked his nets at sunrise. The kingdom bent. But daily life pulled it back together again. Late at night, after long hours of labor and heat, the villages beside the Nile became wonderfully quiet. Only the soft sounds remained. Water touching shore. Wind brushing reeds. A sleeping animal shifting nearby. Occasional footsteps in distant darkness. Oil lamps slowly dimmed inside homes. The stars turned silently overhead. And somewhere in the darkness, another generation of Egyptians slept peacefully beside the river that had carried their civilization gently forward for thousands of years. Before the first pale light reached the eastern horizon, the river towns were already beginning to wake again. Dark shapes moved slowly between narrow homes built from mud brick and straw. A faint blue-gray color spread across the sky above the Nile. The air felt cooler for a short while, carrying the scent of wet riverbanks, smoke from dying cooking fires, and damp earth left behind by the night air. In many homes, people rose quietly so they would not wake the children too early. A woman sat beside a grinding stone and pushed grain slowly beneath her hands. The rough stone made a soft scraping sound that had been heard in Egyptian homes for countless generations. Nearby, a clay lamp flickered weakly. Its small flame moved gently whenever a breeze entered through the doorway. The work began before sunrise because the heat would come quickly later in the day. A man tied simple linen cloth around his waist and stepped outside barefoot onto cool packed earth. Donkeys shifted in their sleep nearby. Somewhere farther down the narrow street, another family prepared bread. The smell drifted softly through the village. Across Egypt, millions of mornings unfolded in almost the same way. This sameness was not considered boring by the people who lived it. It was comforting, predictable, safe. The river rose. The crops grew. The seasons returned. And because the rhythm remained dependable, people could continue even during difficult years. That quiet stability became one of the strongest foundations of Egyptian civilization. In larger towns, the streets slowly filled with movement as dawn arrived fully. Fishermen carried rolled nets over their shoulders toward the water. Potters opened workshops where unfinished jars waited beneath cloth coverings. Merchants unsealed storage rooms heavy with grain sacks and baskets of dried dates. Children carried water jars carefully with both hands. Old men sat together in shaded corners while the morning air was still cool enough for conversation. The kingdom was held together not only by rulers and officials, but by thousands of tiny routines repeated every single day. A baker knew exactly how much grain the village required. A boatman knew how river currents changed with the seasons. A brickmaker knew how wet the mud should feel beneath bare feet. A farmer knew how deep to cut irrigation channels after the flood waters withdrew. This knowledge lived inside ordinary people. And because it lived inside ordinary people, it could survive political changes above them. Far south near the ancient city of Thebes, labor gangs moved slowly toward royal building sites as the sun climbed higher into the sky. Dust rose beneath their sandals. Some workers carried baskets woven from reeds. Others balanced wooden tools against tired shoulders already hardened by years of physical labor. The heat arrived early. By midday the stone surfaces of temple walls became almost painful to touch. Workers wrapped cloth around their heads and necks for protection. Water carriers moved constantly between crews with jars hanging from wooden poles. Even in difficult conditions, there was order. Foremen called names carefully. Scribes recorded attendance. Ration bread was distributed. Beer jars were measured. The work advanced little by little. Ancient Egypt became strong partly because it organized labor so patiently. Massive projects were not rushed. Temple walls rose slowly over decades. Tombs were carved through years of careful effort. Irrigation systems expanded season after season. The civilization learned the power of slow work. And slow work is often more durable than hurried work. At the edge of one construction site, an older laborer rested briefly in the shade of unfinished columns. His hands were rough and cracked from years of lifting stone beneath the desert sun. Sweat moved slowly down his neck. Nearby, younger workers laughed softly together while eating onions and coarse bread during a short midday meal. No one hurried very much in the hottest part of the afternoon. The heat itself forced patience upon the people. Even animals slowed their movement beneath the burning sky. Oxen stood quietly beside heavy sledges. Dogs searched for small patches of shade beneath carts or walls. Birds circled lazily high above the river valley where warm air lifted them gently. The pace of life followed the environment closely. This mattered more than it may first appear. Civilizations often collapse when they demand more energy than people can realistically sustain. But Egypt, for long stretches of history, learned how to move at the pace of the Nile itself. Slowly. Steadily. With long pauses built into the rhythm of life. During flood season, entire regions transformed into quiet inland seas. Water covered fields completely. Palm trees rose above wide stretches of shining flood water. Villages became small islands connected mainly by boats. Children often enjoyed these months most of all. They watched fish swim where dusty roads had once existed. Boats passed silently between flooded fields. The air smelled fresh and wet beneath heavy clouds gathering far to the south. For farmers, flood season brought both relief and worry. The hardest planting work paused temporarily, allowing tired muscles time to recover. But everyone watched the water carefully. Families discussed flood levels late into the evening while sitting beside small lamps. Too much water could wash away homes. Too little water could weaken next year's harvest. The entire kingdom depended on the river behaving properly. This shared dependence united people deeply. Farmers, scribes, priests, craftsmen, and rulers all watched the Nile with the same anxious attention. The river did not belong only to kings. It belonged to everyone. And so, in a quiet way, everyone became invested in preserving the larger system that protected the river valley. Inside temple complexes, priests moved through cool stone halls carrying incense burners that released thin streams of fragrant smoke into the morning air. Their footsteps echoed softly against polished floors. Painted walls showed scenes of offerings, harvests, river life, and divine order. The temples were not only religious spaces. They were economic centers. Storage houses connected to temples often contained enormous amounts of grain, oil, cloth, and goods collected through taxes and offerings. Workers maintained inventories carefully. Scribes checked records repeatedly. In difficult years, these reserves sometimes helped entire regions survive. This was another reason Egypt endured. Resources were distributed through networks that stretched across the kingdom. Not perfectly. Not fairly for everyone. But consistently enough that the structure rarely failed all at once. In small homes beside the riverbanks, ordinary families felt this structure constantly, even if they never thought about it directly. A mother preparing lentils for the evening meal depended on irrigation canals remaining functional. A fisherman depended on safe river trade. A brickmaker depended on flood mud arriving each year. Everything connected quietly together. And when systems connect deeply enough, they become difficult to destroy completely. Near sunset, the light across Egypt softened into warm gold. Date palms cast long shadows across fields where workers finished the last tasks of the day. Farmers washed dirt from their arms in shallow irrigation channels before beginning the slow walk home. The evening breeze finally returned. It moved gently through reeds beside the river and carried away some of the day's terrible heat. Boats drifted northward with the current while square linen sails caught southern winds. Merchants sat quietly among baskets of goods stacked carefully inside the hulls. Some boats carried grain. Others carried stone, pottery, papyrus rolls, or livestock. river travel tied Egypt together more effectively than roads ever could. A message placed on a boat in the south could slowly move north through the entire kingdom. Supplies traveled steadily between cities. Officials inspected regions far from the royal capital. Traders exchanged goods and news from distant places. The Nile functioned like a long breathing path through the center of the civilization. Without it, Egypt would have fractured into isolated communities. With it, Egypt remained connected century after century. As darkness approached, villages beside the river glowed softly with scattered oil lamps. Cooking fires crackled. Bread baked inside clay ovens. The smell of roasted fish drifted through narrow lanes between homes. Children grew sleepy. Workers stretched aching backs and legs. The pace of conversation slowed. In wealthier homes, servants poured water over their masters' hands before meals. In poorer homes, families shared simple bowls of bread, onions, beans, and beer while sitting closely together on woven mats. But rich or poor, nearly everyone depended on the same larger patterns. The flood. The harvest. The storage houses. The river trade. The labor system. These repeating cycles became stronger than individual rulers. And this helps explain why Egypt rarely collapsed suddenly, even during periods of weakness. A dynasty might fail. A palace might fall into political struggle. But the field still needed planting the next morning. The practical needs of life pulled society back toward stability again and again. In the workers' village near royal tomb sites, nighttime brought a deep tired silence after long days spent carving stone chambers beneath the desert cliffs. These villages housed skilled laborers who decorated tomb walls with careful paintings and carved passages deep into the earth. The workers were respected for their skill, but their lives were still difficult. Stone dust filled their lungs. Heat pressed heavily against them underground. Their backs bent for hours in cramped spaces lit only by oil lamps. Yet they formed tight communities. Neighbors shared food. Families gathered together after sunset. Arguments happened, of course, but routines held people close. Some evenings, workers sat outside beneath the stars while rubbing sore hands and wrists. They spoke softly about rations, river levels, children, or supervisors. Nearby, someone repaired a broken sandal strap by lamplight. The desert beyond the village remained vast and silent. And still the work continued. Tombs were prepared carefully because Egyptians believed deeply in continuity beyond death. Life itself was imagined as a kind of long journey that did not simply end. This belief also strengthened stability within society. People worked not only for immediate survival, but for long continuity. Families maintained burial places. Priests maintained rituals. Generations remained connected through memory and tradition. Ancient Egypt thought constantly about permanence. Stone monuments reflected this desire, but so did ordinary family life. Parents taught children familiar prayers. Grandparents repeated old farming knowledge. Craft skills passed carefully through generations. The civilization survived partly because memory itself became sacred. Even clothing reflected the climate and rhythms of labor. Most people wore light linen because heavy fabrics were unbearable beneath Egyptian heat. Workers often shaved their heads or cut hair very short for comfort and cleanliness. Sandals wore down quickly on stone streets and dusty roads. Life was physically exhausting for most people. The body always mattered in Egypt. The aching shoulders of laborers. The cracked hands of fishermen. The tired eyes of scribes bent over papyrus. The swollen feet of servants carrying water jars all day beneath the sun. Civilization depended on human bodies enduring endless repetition. And those bodies required food, rest, shade, and predictable structure. This is one reason major disorder frightened Egyptians so deeply. Chaos threatened survival at the most ordinary level. If canals broke, fields dried. If grain storage failed, families starved. If river trade collapsed, towns suffered quickly. Order was not simply an abstract idea. Order meant bread. Order meant water. Order meant sleep at night without fear. And because ordinary people understood this clearly, many cooperated with the system even when life felt difficult beneath it. In crowded grain storage buildings, workers moved carefully through dusty air carrying baskets filled with harvested grain. Scribes sat nearby recording amounts with brushes dipped in black ink. Cats hunted mice between storage jars. The smell of dry grain filled the warm air. These storage houses became especially important during years of poor harvest. Egypt survived many dangerous periods because food reserves softened the damage. Officials monitored supplies closely. Redistribution systems, though imperfect, allowed the state to respond to shortages better than many neighboring regions could. Again and again, the civilization survived through preparation and routine. Not dramatic brilliance. Not constant military strength. But patient organization repeated over generations. Late one evening beside the Nile, a boatman secured his small vessel against a wooden dock after transporting grain downriver all day. His shoulders hurt from handling ropes and poles. The river reflected silver moonlight across slow-moving water. Nearby, reeds whispered softly in the night breeze. The boatman sat quietly for a moment before walking home. Around him, Egypt rested. Temples stood dark beneath the stars. Fields waited for morning labor. Families slept inside warm mud brick homes. Dogs wandered silent streets. And somewhere far beyond the visible horizon, the Nile continued its endless journey through darkness, carrying the life of Egypt gently forward into another day. In the deepest hours before dawn, when most of the kingdom still slept beneath the soft darkness, the Nile moved quietly through the land like a long ribbon of black glass. Mist gathered low above the water. Palm trees stood motionless along the banks. The desert beyond the fertile valley remained silent and endless beneath the stars. At this hour, Egypt felt almost timeless. A traveler resting beside the river might hear only small sounds. Water touching reeds. A distant bird calling once in the darkness. The faint creaking of a moored fishing boat moving gently with the current. Then, slowly, the kingdom began waking again. A small lamp glowed inside a mud brick house near the riverbank. A woman rose carefully from a woven sleeping mat so she would not wake the youngest child beside her. She wrapped a simple linen cloth around herself and stepped across the cool floor toward the cooking area. Outside, the air still carried the comfort of nighttime coolness, but everyone knew the heat would return soon enough. It always did. This certainty shaped daily life in Egypt just as deeply as the river itself. People learned to move early. To rest when the sun grew too heavy. To save strength. To repeat familiar labor steadily instead of rushing. Even work followed the rhythm of survival. Near the edge of the village, a farmer stepped outdoors carrying a wooden hoe polished smooth by years of use. His feet pressed softly into dusty ground as he walked toward the fields with several other men moving quietly through the pale blue light before sunrise. No one spoke very much at first. Morning often belonged to silence. The workers listened to birds waking in the reeds while the eastern horizon slowly brightened. Thin smoke rose from ovens behind them where bread already baked for the coming day. The smell drifted gently across the village. Bread was always important. Simple flat loaves made from barley or emmer wheat filled the stomachs of workers who needed strength for long hours of labor. Bakers worked constantly throughout Egypt, beginning before dawn each day. The grinding of grain became one of the most familiar sounds in Egyptian homes. Women often spent hours bent over grinding stones. Their backs ached. Their hands hardened. Fine grain dust clung to skin and clothing. The labor was repetitive and exhausting, yet absolutely necessary. So much of Egypt depended on unseen effort like this. A civilization survives not only because of great buildings or famous rulers, but because ordinary people continue doing difficult work every day without stopping. Along irrigation canals, farmers inspected water levels carefully in the growing morning light. Mud pressed between their toes as they repaired small canal walls damaged by erosion or wandering animals. Water moved slowly through narrow channels toward the fields beyond. These canals required constant maintenance. Without them, flood water could not be directed properly. Without proper irrigation, harvests weakened. Without harvests, the kingdom suffered. So generation after generation, workers repaired canals beneath the sun. They cleared mud, rebuilt walls, redirected water. The labor never truly ended. And because it never ended, Egypt endured. Farther north in a busy market town, merchants began arranging goods beneath shaded stalls as sunlight spread across stone streets. Baskets of onions, lentils, dried fish, figs, and dates appeared one by one. Pottery jars lined up beside woven mats. A donkey snorted impatiently while tied beside a cart loaded with grain sacks. The marketplace slowly filled with movement. Sandals scraped against stone. Voices remained calm and low. Children carried baskets through the crowd. A fish seller poured water over fresh catches to keep them cool a little longer beneath the growing heat. The kingdom's economy flowed through these small daily exchanges just as much as through royal treasuries. Ordinary trade mattered deeply. A fisherman selling part of his catch. A potter exchanging jars for grain. A cloth merchant measuring linen carefully beneath an awning. These routines connected villages and cities together into one larger system. And because these routines happened constantly, the system could recover even after periods of disruption. In Egypt, continuity often mattered more than speed. Inside a government storage building not far from the market, scribes already sat cross-legged on reed mats recording deliveries. Papyrus sheets rested across their knees. Wooden pallets held black and red ink. Nearby, workers carried baskets of grain into tall storage chambers where the dry smell of harvested crops filled the air. The scribes worked patiently. One recorded numbers. Another checked previous records. A supervisor inspected measurements. The room remained warm even in the morning. Flies drifted lazily through shafts of sunlight entering from narrow windows high in the wall. It may not have looked impressive from the outside. But this quiet administrative work formed the backbone of Egyptian stability. Records allowed officials to track food supplies across long distances. Taxes supported labor projects and storage systems. Information moved slowly but steadily along the Nile. Egypt survived because it remembered things carefully. A failed harvest in one region could sometimes be eased by grain from another. A damaged canal could be repaired through organized labor. A weak local official could be replaced while the larger system continued operating. The civilization became resilient partly because responsibility spread across many layers of society instead of resting entirely on one ruler. At the same time, life for ordinary people remained physically demanding almost every day. The heat itself wore people down slowly. By midday the sun pressed heavily across the land. Stone walls radiated warmth back into narrow streets. Workers wrapped cloth over their heads while sweat darkened linen clothing. Animals searched desperately for shade beneath trees or beside buildings. Many laborers paused briefly during the hottest hours. Not because they were lazy. Because the human body could only endure so much. In fields near the river, farmers rested beneath small shelters made from reeds and wood while eating onions, bread, and salted fish beside irrigation channels. Some washed dust from their faces. Others simply sat quietly, conserving energy. The Nile moved slowly nearby. Its steady presence comforted people. Even during hard times, the river remained familiar. Children born beside the Nile often spent their entire lives within sight of its water. They learned its moods, smells, and sounds from earliest childhood. They knew how morning mist looked above the river in winter months. They knew how flood water smelled when it first spread across dry soil. The river became part of memory itself. And memory helped bind Egypt together across centuries. In the workshops of skilled craftsmen, labor continued carefully despite the heat. Stone carvers tapped gently at statues while pale dust gathered around their feet. Jewelers bent over delicate gold pieces beneath dim light entering through roof openings. Carpenters shaped wooden furniture for wealthier homes and temple buildings. Some workshops were family businesses passed through generations. A young apprentice learned by watching older hands move patiently through familiar motions. How to smooth wood evenly. How to shape clay without collapse. How to carve symbols correctly into stone. These skills required years of repetition. Egyptian society valued mastery that developed slowly over time. There was comfort in doing things the old way. Comfort in preserving methods that already worked. This resistance to sudden change helped create stability, though it could also make adaptation slower during certain crises. Still, for long periods, the system functioned remarkably well. Along the riverbanks, fishermen repaired torn nets during the afternoon shade. Their boats rested partly on muddy shorelines where reeds bent in the breeze. The smell of fish mixed with river mud and damp rope. Fishing communities understood patience better than most. Some days the river provided generously. Other days it remained stubbornly quiet. Yet fishermen returned every morning because routine itself offered survival. They watched water movement carefully. Bird patterns. Weather shifts. Moonlight on the river. Knowledge accumulated slowly over lifetimes. An older fisherman might teach younger boys how to cast nets properly while standing knee-deep in warm water at sunset. The boys listened closely because mistakes meant hunger. This quiet transfer of practical knowledge happened constantly across Egypt. Parents teaching children. Masters teaching apprentices. Experienced workers guiding younger hands. Civilization endured because memory endured. As evening approached, shadows lengthened across the fields. The worst heat finally began to loosen its grip on the land. Farmers finished final tasks before darkness. Herd animals moved slowly toward enclosures near villages. Boats drifted toward docks carrying goods from distant towns. The evening hours often felt softer than the rest of the day. People relaxed slightly. Conversation returned. Families gathered. Cooking fires appeared one by one beside homes. The smell of lentil stew, roasted fish, and fresh bread drifted through narrow streets while children played in fading sunlight. Some villagers visited neighbors before nightfall. Others sat quietly outside homes watching the sky darken above the palms. In wealthier districts of larger cities, servants lit oil lamps along interior halls while musicians played soft instruments during evening meals. But even the wealthy depended on the same deeper structures as everyone else. The harvest still mattered. The canals still mattered. The river still mattered. No one escaped the rhythm of the Nile completely. This shared dependence created an unusual kind of unity across Egyptian society. Not equality. Life remained very unequal. But interconnectedness. A noble depended on farmers for grain. Farmers depended on officials for irrigation management. Officials depended on scribes for records. Scribes depended on craftsmen for papyrus and tools. Everything connected together quietly beneath the surface. And systems built from many connections often survive damage better than systems built from only one source of strength. Night settled gradually across the kingdom. The sky turned deep blue and then black. Stars appeared slowly above temple towers and palm groves. The temperature cooled enough for easier breathing. Workers stretched sore backs after long days beneath the sun. Some rubbed oil into aching muscles. Others simply lay still beside open windows where night air could enter. In crowded homes, entire families slept close together on woven mats. The sounds of breathing filled dark rooms. Outside, dogs wandered silent streets searching for scraps. The smell of river water drifted softly through villages. Far away in the desert hills, guards watched over tombs and storage sites beneath moonlight. Their fires glowed faintly against the darkness. Sand moved quietly across stone. Even at night, Egypt never became completely still. Temple rituals continued. River boats traveled slowly beneath stars. Night watchmen walked city streets carrying lamps. Bakers sometimes began work before midnight to prepare enough bread for morning markets. The civilization breathed continuously, day and night. And this constant movement helped prevent collapse. A society that depends entirely on one person can break suddenly when that person disappears. But Egypt depended on millions of ongoing actions repeated endlessly by ordinary people. So even when dynasties weakened, daily life continued. A king might die. Political struggles might spread through palaces. Yet somewhere beside the Nile, a mother still prepared bread before dawn. A fisherman still untangled his nets. A scribe still counted grain jars. The deeper rhythm survived. In many ways, Egypt functioned less like a fragile tower and more like a river itself. Always moving. Always adjusting. Never completely frozen. This flexibility mattered during periods of invasion or internal unrest. Foreign rulers sometimes controlled parts of Egypt, yet they often adopted Egyptian administrative systems instead of destroying them entirely. Why? Because the system worked. The canals worked. The grain storage worked. The taxation worked. The river trade worked. Destroying those systems would damage everyone, including the conquerors themselves. So Egypt often absorbed change slowly instead of collapsing beneath it. Even foreign rulers eventually found themselves relying on Egyptian scribes, Egyptian farmers, Egyptian labor systems, and Egyptian river transport. The civilization possessed enormous cultural gravity. It pulled newcomers into its rhythms. Late one night beside the Nile, an elderly farmer sat outside his small home after the rest of his family had fallen asleep. The air had finally cooled. Reeds whispered softly along the riverbank nearby. He listened to the familiar sounds of nighttime Egypt. Water moving slowly. Insects singing. A distant boat creaking against its rope. The old man had lived through floods, droughts, new rulers, heavy taxes, sickness, and poor harvests. He had buried friends and watched children grow into adults with families of their own. And still the river flowed. Still the morning work returned. Still bread baked in village ovens before dawn. The kingdom around him seemed enormous and ancient, yet also strangely intimate, built from countless ordinary moments just like this quiet night beside the water. Above him, the stars drifted silently across the dark Egyptian sky while the Nile carried its endless current gently northward through the sleeping land. Long before sunrise, when the stars still hung over the river valley and the desert remained wrapped in cool darkness, small movements quietly began across Egypt once more. A temple servant crossed a silent courtyard carrying a clay lamp protected carefully from the breeze with one hand. The flame trembled softly against painted stone walls. Somewhere deeper inside the temple, priests were already awake, washing themselves with cool water drawn from sacred basins before the morning rituals began. Outside the temple walls, the city still slept. Dogs curled beside doorways. Boats rocked gently against wooden docks. A faint smell of damp river mud drifted through the darkness. These quiet hours before dawn were often the calmest moments in Egyptian life. The terrible heat had not yet returned. The streets remained empty. Even the donkeys seemed slower and quieter in the cool air. But beneath this stillness, the machinery of the kingdom was already beginning to move again. In a small riverside village farther south, a young boy followed his father toward the fields carrying a bundle of tools almost too large for his thin arms. His feet were dusty before the sun had even risen. He walked carefully beside the older man, trying to step where his father stepped. The father spoke softly about irrigation walls damaged during the last flood. About which fields would need planting first. About how to judge the soil by touch alone. The boy listened quietly. This was how Egypt preserved itself. Not only through laws or armies or temples, but through endless teaching. Knowledge passed from tired hands to younger hands over and over again until the process became almost invisible. An old fisherman teaching currents. A mother teaching bread making. A scribe teaching careful writing. A stoneworker teaching patience. The civilization survived because ordinary people carried memory inside daily routines. Along the eastern horizon, pale light slowly spread upward into the sky. The Nile reflected the first colors of morning in long shimmering lines across the dark water. Birds moved through the reeds. Somewhere nearby, cattle lowed softly as workers led them toward the fields. Then the day truly began. In farming regions, labor started early because the cooler morning hours were precious. Men and women moved steadily through fields still damp from irrigation water. Wooden hoes pressed into soft earth. Seeds scattered carefully by hand. The work required constant attention. Canals had to remain clear. Soil had to remain moist. Animals had to be watched carefully. A single damaged canal could ruin part of a harvest. Too much delay beneath the Egyptian sun could leave workers dangerously exhausted before midday. So people learned efficiency through repetition. Not hurried movement. Not frantic speed. Simply steady labor repeated correctly. This rhythm became deeply comforting to many Egyptians because it gave shape to life. A person always knew what came next. Flood season. Planting season. Harvest season. Repair season. The years moved in circles instead of straight lines. And circular time feels stable. In other lands, kingdoms often expanded too quickly. Rulers demanded constant conquest or endless construction beyond what ordinary people could sustain. But Egypt's greatest strength often came from its willingness to repeat what already worked. The Nile encouraged this way of thinking. The river did not rush. It returned patiently each year. And the people followed its example. Near Memphis, one of the great cities of ancient Egypt, streets slowly filled with merchants and laborers as the morning brightened. Dust rose into warm sunlight beneath hundreds of moving feet. Pottery sellers arranged jars and bowls outside workshops while carpenters carried unfinished furniture into shaded market spaces. The city smelled of many things at once. Fresh bread, animal dung, wood smoke, sweat, wet clay, fish from the river markets. Life crowded closely together in these cities. Homes often stood shoulder to shoulder along narrow winding streets where sunlight only reached certain corners for brief parts of the day. Servants hurried between homes carrying water jars balanced carefully against hips or shoulders. Scribes walked toward administrative buildings with papyrus rolls tucked beneath their arms. Wealthier citizens traveled beneath shaded litters while workers stepped aside respectfully along the roads. But even the wealthiest people in Egypt depended on the same invisible foundation: the labor of ordinary bodies. A nobleman's breakfast still required farmers to grow grain. Temple rituals still required workers to carry offerings. Royal monuments still required stone haulers, tool makers, cooks, water carriers, and scribes. Egypt's system remained durable partly because labor itself was spread across so many interconnected layers. No single failure destroyed everything at once. In a crowded bakery near the center of the city, the heat from clay ovens already filled the room heavily though morning had barely begun. Bakers moved quickly in the dim orange light, sweat shining across arms and faces. Dough-covered wooden tables. Ash floated through the air. Bread was everywhere in Egypt. Rich families ate softer loaves made from finer flour. Poor families often ate rougher bread filled with bits of grit from grinding stones. Yet nearly everyone relied upon it daily. The bakers worked with practiced rhythm. Shape the dough. Feed the ovens. Remove finished loaves. Start again. Hour after hour. Outside, buyers waited patiently with baskets while the smell of fresh bread drifted into the busy street. This endless repetition formed the true heartbeat of Egyptian civilization. People often imagine history through battles or rulers. But most Egyptians experienced history through routine instead. Waking before dawn. Carrying water. Repairing tools. Cooking meals. Working until muscles ached. Resting briefly in shade. Sleeping beside family members after dark. And then beginning again the next morning. The routines themselves became stabilizing forces. In the western desert beyond the fertile valley, caravans moved slowly across dry landscapes beneath enormous skies. Donkeys carried copper, incense, stone, or luxury goods between distant regions. Travelers wrapped cloth tightly around their heads against wind-blown sand. The desert looked empty from far away, but it was deeply connected to Egypt's survival. Stone quarries supplied building projects. Mining expeditions brought valuable materials. Trade routes linked Egypt to neighboring lands. Yet the desert also protected the kingdom. Invading armies faced terrible conditions before even reaching the river valley. Water was scarce. Heat was brutal. Distances felt endless. The geography itself helped preserve Egyptian stability. Most people lived packed closely beside the Nile because beyond that narrow fertile ribbon lay harsh emptiness. This concentration of population created another advantage. Communication moved more easily along the river corridor. Administration became more manageable. Food distribution remained possible across large distances. The Nile unified everything. Even language and religious beliefs traveled steadily along the water routes. At midday the heat pressed heavily over the land again. In construction areas, workers slowed their pace beneath the burning sun. Some rested beneath temporary shade shelters built from linen cloth stretched across wooden poles. Water jars stood nearby wrapped in damp fabric to keep them cooler. Stone workers wiped dust from their faces. Carpenters flexed sore hands. Labor supervisors checked ration supplies. The kingdom depended heavily on human endurance, yet Egypt also understood limits better than many ancient societies. People paused during the hottest hours because survival required it. The environment forced humility. No one truly defeated the sun. No ruler controlled the flood completely. Nature remained larger than human ambition. And perhaps this helped Egypt avoid certain kinds of collapse. The civilization adapted itself around natural rhythms instead of trying endlessly to overpower them. Along shaded temple gardens, priests walked slowly beside pools filled with lotus flowers while birds moved through papyrus reeds nearby. Temple grounds often felt calmer than crowded city streets. Thick stone walls held cooler air inside shaded corridors. Some temples employed hundreds of people. Priests, servants, gardeners, scribes, cooks, craftsmen, storage keepers, animal handlers. Large temples functioned almost like small cities themselves, deeply woven into the economy and daily life of surrounding regions. Offerings arrived constantly. Grain shipments, livestock, cloth, wine, oil. Everything was counted carefully, stored carefully, redistributed carefully. These institutions helped create continuity across generations because they outlasted individual rulers. A pharaoh might die unexpectedly. A royal family might lose power. But temple systems often continued functioning beneath the transition. Rituals still happened at sunrise. Food still entered storage rooms. Workers still received assignments. The larger rhythm continued. Late in the afternoon, shadows finally began stretching longer across the fields. Workers straightened aching backs and looked toward the lowering sun with quiet relief. Birds gathered above irrigation canals. Oxen moved slowly through soft earth pulling simple plows. The air softened slightly. Children ran through village paths carrying bundles of reeds or small clay jars. Women prepared evening meals beside outdoor ovens while speaking quietly together about crops, family matters, or rising river levels. The conversations of ordinary people rarely entered official records. Yet these conversations carried the emotional life of Egypt itself. Worries about food. Pride in children. Complaints about taxes. Stories remembered from older generations. The civilization rested inside these small human moments as much as inside temples or palaces. At the edge of one village, an elderly woman sat weaving baskets while evening light turned the river gold beside her. Her fingers moved slowly but confidently through the reeds. She had woven baskets for most of her life. For grain, fish, laundry, storage. The work no longer required much thought. Her hands simply remembered. And all across Egypt, hands remembered things. How to build walls from mud brick. How to preserve fish with salt. How to navigate difficult river currents. How to calculate harvest shares. This memory lived everywhere at once. Which meant it could survive even when parts of the kingdom weakened. As darkness approached, the sounds of labor gradually faded from the fields and workshops. Boats returned toward shore carrying tired fishermen beneath skies turning orange and deep purple. Smoke rose from cooking fires into the evening air. The Nile reflected the colors of sunset beautifully. Slow ripples of gold and red drifted across the water while palm trees became dark shapes against the glowing horizon. Then night came softly again. Oil lamps flickered behind windows. Families gathered close together for food and rest. Some people slept on rooftops beneath open skies where cooler air moved gently across tired bodies. Others remained awake a little longer, talking quietly beneath the stars. Far from the villages, desert jackals cried faintly in the darkness. The river continued flowing. Always flowing. And perhaps that was the deepest reason Egypt survived for so long. The civilization learned how to move like the Nile itself. Not rigid. Not frozen. But steady. When pressure came, it adjusted. When rulers changed, life continued. When hardship arrived, people relied on familiar routines and shared memory. The kingdom did not avoid suffering. It knew famine, corruption, invasion, exhaustion, disease, and political conflict. But beneath all those troubles remained the ordinary rhythm of daily life beside the river. A rhythm so deeply rooted that even centuries of change could not easily erase it. And so, beneath the ancient stars, beside the dark quiet Nile, Egypt carried itself gently forward once again into another waiting dawn. The river was quiet in the hour before dawn. A thin layer of mist drifted above the dark water while the first cool breeze of morning moved softly through the reeds. Along the Nile's muddy banks, boats rested against wooden posts, rocking almost invisibly with the slow current. The stars still reflected faintly across the surface of the river, though the eastern sky had already begun to pale. Egypt often felt most peaceful at this hour. The heat had loosened its grip for a little while. The streets were empty. The workshops silent. Even the animals moved more slowly. But inside homes throughout the river valley, people were beginning to wake again. A mother sat near a small oil lamp shaping dough with tired hands while children still slept beside one another on woven mats. The room smelled faintly of smoke and warm clay. Nearby, jars of grain rested against the wall beneath hanging bundles of onions and garlic. Outside, a man poured water slowly over his face before preparing for another day in the fields. The motions were familiar. Wash. Dress. Gather tools. Walk toward the river. These routines repeated so often that they became almost invisible to the people living them. Yet the stability of Egypt depended on millions of ordinary acts exactly like these. Long-lasting civilizations are often built quietly. Not in moments of glory, but in repetition. Along narrow village paths, workers moved silently together beneath the fading stars. Some carried wooden hoes across their shoulders. Others guided donkeys loaded with baskets or tools. Sand pressed softly beneath their sandals. The fields waited beside the river. Dark soil. Wet irrigation channels. Young crops rising carefully toward the coming sunlight. The farmers understood the land deeply because their survival depended on understanding it. They could feel changes in the soil beneath bare feet. They noticed subtle differences in river smell during flood season. They watched bird patterns and cloud movements with patient attention. This knowledge was practical, slow, and ancient. And because it passed through generations without interruption, Egypt maintained continuity even during political uncertainty. A weak ruler might sit on the throne. Taxes might rise. Local officials might become corrupt. Still, the farmers woke before dawn. Still, the river flooded. Still, grain needed planting. Daily necessity often proved stronger than political instability. As sunlight slowly spread across the valley, the green ribbon of fertile land emerged clearly from the surrounding desert. Palm groves cast long shadows over canals and pathways. Birds moved across the sky in loose formations while fishermen pushed narrow boats away from shore using long wooden poles. The desert beyond remained dry and still. A hard, empty world of sand and stone. But beside the Nile, life gathered densely. Villages. Fields. Temples. Workshops. Storage houses. Everything clustered close to the water because the water meant survival. This concentration helped Egypt remain unified. People lived along one long connected corridor rather than scattered across enormous open spaces. Boats traveling the river could carry messages, officials, grain, workers, and goods steadily from region to region. The Nile tied the kingdom together physically and emotionally. People trusted the river because the river returned every year. Trust is powerful in human societies. Especially trust built slowly over centuries. Near a riverside workshop, potters had already begun their morning labor. Wet clay rested in large piles covered with damp cloth. One worker sat beside a spinning wheel shaping jars with practiced hands while another carried finished pieces toward the sunlight for drying. The air smelled rich and earthy. Clay pressed cool against tired fingers. The wheel turned steadily. Again and again. Many Egyptian crafts relied on repetitive movement. Weaving linen. Grinding grain. Carving stone. Shaping pottery. Sanding wood. Each task demanded patience more than speed. This patient culture influenced the civilization deeply. Buildings rose slowly. Records accumulated carefully. Canals expanded gradually. The kingdom did not depend entirely on rapid expansion or sudden change. Instead, Egypt strengthened itself through accumulation over long periods of time. A canal repaired every season. A temple expanded one courtyard at a time. A storage system improved generation after generation. These slow improvements created surprising resilience. In larger cities, scribes gathered early inside administrative buildings before the worst heat arrived. Sunlight entered through narrow windows and stretched across papyrus rolls stacked carefully on low wooden shelves. Ink pallets rested beside water jars while officials discussed grain deliveries in calm voices. The scribes worked quietly for long hours. Their brushes moved steadily across papyrus. Numbers. Names. Measurements. Taxes. Labor assignments. The records of Egypt became enormous over time because administration touched nearly every aspect of life. Grain harvests were counted. Livestock counted. Workers counted. Land measured and measured again. This careful organization gave the kingdom strength. It allowed resources to move where needed. It allowed labor to be coordinated. It allowed rulers to understand, at least partially, what was happening across distant regions. The system was imperfect, of course. Mistakes happened constantly. Corruption existed everywhere humans gathered power. Yet the structure itself endured remarkably well. Because even flawed systems can survive if they remain familiar and predictable. Near midday, the sun climbed high above the valley and the heat returned heavily once more. Workers wrapped linen cloth around their heads and necks. Sweat darkened clothing almost immediately. Air shimmered above stone roads and temple courtyards. In the fields, labor slowed slightly. Not stopped. Simply softened. People learned long ago that fighting the Egyptian sun too aggressively only led to exhaustion or illness. So they adapted. Rest beneath shade. Drink water carefully. Resume work steadily. The environment itself taught patience and moderation. An older farmer resting beside an irrigation canal might close his eyes briefly while listening to the sound of moving water nearby. His hands were rough from decades of labor. Fine lines marked the corners of his eyes from years spent squinting beneath sunlight reflected off river water and pale soil. His life had likely changed very little across the decades. The same fields. The same flood cycles. The same village paths. Some outsiders might imagine this kind of life as repetitive beyond endurance. but repetition can also create emotional stability. Familiar tasks reduce uncertainty. Shared routines connect people across generations. The farmer probably worked the same land his father once worked. And perhaps his son would continue after him. This continuity gave many Egyptians a strong sense of place within the larger world. Farther south near the great stone temples, priests moved through shaded halls carrying offerings toward sacred chambers hidden deep inside the complexes. Incense smoke drifted through cool air scented faintly with oil and flowers. Temple life followed strict routines. Morning purification. Offerings. Prayers. Maintenance of sacred objects. Festivals tied to the river and seasons. The rituals rarely changed quickly. And this mattered greatly. Stable religious traditions reinforced stable social traditions. When people saw the same ceremonies performed year after year, generation after generation, it strengthened the feeling that the world itself remained orderly and dependable. This feeling helped Egypt survive periods of fear and uncertainty. During years when floods failed or political conflicts spread, people still gathered for familiar rituals. Priests still lit incense. Hymns still echoed through temple halls. The continuity itself became comforting. Late in the afternoon, the harsh brightness of the day slowly softened. Workers emerging from quarries brushed pale dust from their arms and faces. Fishermen checked nets along quiet riverbanks while children chased one another between palm trees. The smell of evening cooking fires gradually spread through villages. Bread baking. Fish roasting. Lentils simmering slowly in clay pots. Families gathered close after long days of labor because nighttime offered the only real relief from heat and work. Oil lamps flickered warmly against mud brick walls while conversations moved softly through crowded rooms. Some spoke about crops. Others about taxes or local disputes. Children listened sleepily while older relatives repeated stories they themselves had heard many years before. The oral memory of Egypt stretched deeply through family life. Stories about floods, ancestors, old rulers, strange weather, good harvests, hard years. This constant sharing of memory helped preserve cultural continuity even when written records remained limited to educated classes. In one small riverside home, an elderly grandmother carefully repaired a fishing net while grandchildren watched beside her. Her fingers moved automatically through the worn rope. Tie. Pull. Loop. Tighten. The children would likely learn the same motions eventually. And so Egypt quietly carried itself forward from one generation into the next. Outside, night gathered slowly across the river valley. The sky darkened into deep blue. Then black. Stars returned above the desert. Workers stretched tired bodies before sleep. Some climbed onto rooftops where cooler air moved gently through the darkness. Others slept beside open doorways listening to insects singing near the riverbanks. The Nile reflected moonlight in long silver shapes across the water. Boats drifted silently. Palm leaves whispered softly in the night breeze. In distant guard posts near tombs and storage sites, small fires glowed against the desert darkness while watchmen fought sleep during long quiet hours. Everywhere across Egypt, the same great rhythm continued. Wake before dawn. Work beneath the sun. Rest at night. Trust the river. Prepare for the next flood. This rhythm became stronger than individual rulers because it lived inside ordinary people. A dynasty could disappear. Foreign armies could arrive. Palaces could struggle with intrigue and ambition. Yet most Egyptians still needed to eat, plant, repair, trade, carry water, grind grain, and sleep beside their families at night. Daily life created a kind of invisible stability beneath political change. And because Egypt's daily life remained so deeply tied to natural cycles that almost never changed, the civilization itself gained unusual endurance. The Nile continued flowing northward. The stars continued crossing the desert sky. The floodwaters continued arriving from distant southern lands. As long as those rhythms survived, Egypt could recover again and again. Late into the night, when nearly all voices had faded and most lamps had burned low, the river moved softly through the darkness beside sleeping villages and silent temples. The kingdom rested. Tired workers slept beneath warm night air. Children dreamed beside open windows. Boats creaked gently at their moorings. And beyond the quiet riverbanks, the ancient desert watched silently while Egypt carried on through another calm and endless night. In the quiet hours before sunrise, the Nile Valley rested beneath a soft gray darkness that seemed to hold the whole world still for a little while longer. The river moved slowly between its banks, calm and heavy beneath the fading stars. Cool air drifted through clusters of palm trees and across sleeping villages where mud brick homes stood close together in uneven rows. Thin smoke from dying cooking fires lingered low above the rooftops. Inside one small house near the water, a fisherman woke before the rest of his family. He sat still for a moment on his woven mat, listening to the deep silence of the early morning. Nearby, his youngest child slept beside a clay wall, breathing softly beneath a thin linen cloth. The fisherman rose carefully. His knees ached from years spent standing in river water and pulling heavy nets. He wrapped cloth around his waist, picked up a coil of rope, and stepped outside into the cool darkness. The earth beneath his feet still held traces of nighttime moisture. Soon the heat would return. Soon the flies would gather. Soon sweat would run down every back in the valley once again. But for now, the air remained gentle. Across Egypt, countless people woke at almost exactly the same hour. Farmers, bakers, water carriers, temple servants, scribes, potters, laborers. Their lives were different in many ways, yet all were tied to the same larger rhythm. Wake early. Work steadily. Endure the heat. Rest at night. Begin again. This pattern repeated through generations so consistently that it became part of the emotional structure of Egyptian life. Routine created security. Security created endurance. And endurance allowed Egypt to survive long stretches of history that might have destroyed other kingdoms. Near the riverbank, the fisherman untied his small boat from a wooden post while mist drifted low across the water. The reeds whispered softly nearby. He pushed the boat outward with one slow movement and climbed inside carefully, balancing against the gentle rocking. The Nile smelled rich in the early morning. Mud. Wet reeds. Fish. Cool water. The fisherman dipped his paddle quietly into the river and moved out into the darkness where faint shapes of other boats already drifted ahead of him. Fishing was difficult work. Nets tore easily. Storms sometimes overturned boats. Crocodiles still appeared in certain regions. Yet the river also fed entire communities. And because it fed them reliably most years, people continued trusting its rhythms. Trust mattered deeply in Egypt. Not only trust in rulers or priests, but trust in the natural order itself. The flood would come. The river would rise. The soil would darken again. The cycle would continue. This confidence allowed people to plan far into the future. To build slowly. To preserve traditions. To remain patient. As the eastern sky brightened, movement spread across the villages beside the Nile. Women carried clay jars toward public wells or river access points before the heat became too strong. Donkeys brayed softly while being loaded with grain sacks or baskets. Children rubbed sleep from their eyes while smoke rose from ovens already warming for the morning bread. The smell of baking drifted through the narrow lanes. Warm grain. Ash. Clay. A mother flattened dough carefully against the inside wall of a heated oven while speaking quietly to her daughter beside her. The girl watched closely, learning through observation rather than formal teaching. This was how most knowledge survived in Egypt. Through watching, repeating, remembering. Very few people wrote books or official histories. But millions carried practical memory inside their hands and bodies. How to shape mud bricks correctly. How to tie river knots. How to judge whether grain had spoiled. How to repair a cracked jar with resin and cloth. Civilization lived inside these ordinary skills. And because these skills spread across the population instead of remaining isolated among elites, Egypt remained remarkably difficult to break apart completely. In the fields, farmers already worked beneath the growing light of dawn. Irrigation channels reflected pale gold sunlight while workers inspected water flow carefully. Some carried baskets of seed. Others repaired small sections of canal walls weakened by erosion. Water management shaped nearly every aspect of Egyptian life. Without canals, flood water could not spread properly. Without stored water, crops failed during dry periods. Without coordinated labor, irrigation systems collapsed. So communities cooperated constantly around water itself. Neighbors repaired canals together. Officials organized labor schedules. Farmers monitored flood levels collectively. The Nile forced cooperation because everyone depended on the same river. And societies built around shared dependence often develop stronger long-term stability. In many ways, Egypt functioned almost like one enormous river community stretched across hundreds of miles. Farther north in a crowded administrative center, scribes entered cool storage buildings lined with papyrus bundles and wooden record chests. The stone walls protected the interior from some of the coming heat. Dust floated slowly through shafts of sunlight entering from narrow openings near the ceiling. The scribes settled cross-legged on reed mats and prepared ink carefully. Black ink for ordinary writing. Red ink for important headings or warnings. Their work required patience more than speed. A grain shipment counted incorrectly could create confusion for an entire region. A labor roster copied poorly could disrupt major construction projects. So scribes learned caution, careful repetition, neat organization. The Egyptian state survived partly because information itself moved steadily through the kingdom. River levels, tax collections, harvest estimates, storage records, work assignments, all written slowly by tired human hands. And although mistakes happened constantly, the overall structure endured because it operated continuously for centuries. Systems become strong through long use. Even flawed systems. Outside the administrative buildings, market streets filled gradually with noise and movement as the morning advanced. Merchants called softly to passing buyers beneath hanging cloth awnings that blocked some of the sun. Fish sellers arranged fresh catches on wet reed mats. Pottery glowed reddish-brown in stacked rows outside workshops. The streets smelled alive. Sweat. Animals. Fresh bread. River mud. Smoke. Spices brought through trade routes from distant lands. Egypt connected to many neighboring regions through commerce, but the civilization never depended entirely on outside trade for survival. This also strengthened its stability. The Nile provided grain internally. Fishing supported local diets. Mud from the floodplains supplied building material. Papyrus grew naturally along the river. Egypt possessed many essential resources within its own borders. Self-sufficiency protected the kingdom during periods when trade weakened or foreign conflicts disrupted travel routes. Near midday, sunlight pressed heavily against the land again. Workers squinted against the brightness reflecting from pale stone walls and dry earth. In quarries beyond the fertile valley, laborers hammered at stone beneath brutal heat while supervisors tracked progress from shaded shelters nearby. The work was exhausting. Dust filled noses and mouths. Hands blistered. Shoulders burned beneath the sun. Yet even hard labor followed structured rhythms. Work crews organized carefully. Meals distributed regularly. Rest periods observed when possible. The Egyptians understood that large projects required sustainability over many years. A temple might take decades to complete. A tomb system might continue expanding across generations. Nothing important happened quickly. And perhaps this protected Egypt from certain kinds of collapse. Civilizations built entirely around rapid expansion often exhaust themselves. Egypt expanded sometimes, certainly. But its deepest strength remained internal continuity rather than endless outward growth. In workers' villages near royal construction sites, families adapted to difficult conditions with quiet resilience. Homes were small and crowded. Water had to be carried carefully. Food supplies depended heavily on official distribution. Still, communities formed strong bonds. Neighbors shared tools. Women cooked together. Children played between unfinished walls while adults rested after long labor shifts. Human connection softened hardship. At sunset, workers returning from stone quarries often appeared almost ghost-like beneath layers of pale dust. They washed at communal water points while speaking quietly about injuries, supervisors, or food rations. Nearby, evening meals cooked slowly in clay pots while smoke drifted upward into the darkening sky. The heat finally loosened again. Night air moved gently through the villages. The relief felt physical and emotional at once. Evening brought a softness back into life after the harsh brightness of day. Fishermen repaired nets beside the river. Older people sat outside homes telling stories. Children slowly grew sleepy. The Nile reflected the colors of sunset in long ribbons of gold and deep blue. Then darkness settled over the valley once more. Temple lamps flickered behind stone columns. Boat lanterns drifted quietly across the river. Stars returned above the desert. And beneath those stars, Egypt continued breathing through its endless nightly rhythm. One reason the civilization rarely collapsed completely was because its strength did not come only from rulers or armies. Its strength came from familiarity. People knew where water came from. They knew how to grow food. They knew how to repair canals. They knew how to organize labor. Even during political chaos, ordinary life often continued because practical knowledge remained alive among the population. A kingdom built entirely on fear may break quickly once fear weakens. But Egypt rested heavily on habit. And habits can survive almost anything. Late one night, after the villages had grown silent and most lamps had burned low, a temple scribe sat alone beside a small oil flame reviewing grain records from several nearby districts. The room was warm and still. Outside, insects sang softly in the darkness. The scribe dipped his brush into ink again and continued working patiently despite his tired eyes. Line after line. Number after number. Quiet labor hidden from history. Yet work like this held the civilization together as surely as the massive stones of the pyramids. Because Egypt survived through countless unseen efforts performed faithfully every day by ordinary people whose names disappeared long ago into the river of time. And outside the quiet building, beyond the sleeping villages and silent temples, the Nile continued flowing northward beneath the stars exactly as it always had, carrying the life of Egypt gently onward through another ancient night. The Nile carried the night quietly through the valley. Moonlight stretched across the slow-moving water in pale silver lines while reeds swayed gently along the muddy banks. Most of Egypt slept beneath the warm darkness. Villages rested in silence except for the occasional cry of a distant animal or the soft creaking of boats tied beside wooden docks. The desert beyond the fertile land looked endless beneath the stars. Dark hills rose faintly against the horizon. Sand shifted slowly in the nighttime wind. And between those silent deserts, the narrow ribbon of Egyptian life continued breathing softly beside the river. In a small farming village, an elderly man woke before dawn as he had done for most of his life. For a few quiet moments he remained still, listening to the sounds around him. The breathing of sleeping grandchildren. A donkey moving outside. Wind brushing against the walls of the house. His joints ached in the cool morning air. Years of lifting, digging, planting, and carrying had worn his body slowly down. Yet he rose carefully from his mat and prepared for another day because work in Egypt rarely paused for long. Outside, the sky remained dark blue above the palms. The old man walked toward the river carrying empty water jars balanced across a wooden pole resting on his shoulders. Other villagers were already moving quietly along the same path. Some nodded softly in greeting without speaking. People often saved their energy in the early morning. Words could wait until later. At the riverbank, water touched the shore with a calm, steady sound. The old man knelt slowly and filled the jars one at a time. Nearby, women washed clothing against smooth stones while speaking quietly together. Children still half asleep stood beside them rubbing tired eyes. The Nile belonged to everyone. Rich or poor, farmer or priest, laborer or noble, nearly every person in Egypt depended upon the same river each day. That shared dependence created deep stability inside the civilization. Because when everyone relies on the same natural system, preserving that system becomes part of ordinary survival. As dawn approached, pale sunlight slowly revealed the fields stretching beside the water. Irrigation canals glimmered softly beneath the growing light. Date palms cast long shadows across pathways where workers already moved toward the farmland carrying tools and baskets. The day began gently. No sudden movement. No loud urgency. Just the familiar beginning of labor returning once again. In one field, a young farmer pressed his bare feet into wet soil while guiding oxen through soft earth. The animals moved patiently beneath the morning sky. Mud splashed lightly against the farmer's legs as he adjusted the simple wooden plow behind him. He had learned this work from his father. His father had learned it from another generation before him. The motions felt ancient because they were ancient. This continuity mattered deeply. Egypt survived because knowledge stayed rooted in place. Farming methods remained familiar. Canal systems followed known patterns. Seasonal routines repeated across centuries with only gradual change. Even when rulers disappeared, ordinary workers still understood how to continue life. That practical continuity acted like hidden roots beneath the civilization. In larger towns, the streets slowly filled with movement as the sun climbed higher. Bakers carried fresh loaves from clay ovens while smoke drifted upward into the warming air. Potters arranged newly fired jars outside workshops. Merchants swept dust from storefront entrances before opening for the day. The city's sounds gathered gradually. Sandals against stone. Animal carts rolling over rough streets. Workers calling softly to one another. Hammers tapping in distant workshops. The smell of bread mixed with sweat, smoke, river mud, and hot stone. Egyptian cities were crowded but deeply organized beneath the surface. Certain districts specialized in certain trades. Workshops clustered together. Storage buildings stood near transport routes along the river. Temples controlled large amounts of land and resources nearby. The structure of daily life repeated so consistently that people could navigate it almost without thought. And predictable structures create emotional calm even during difficult times. Inside one administrative building near the river docks, scribes bent over papyrus records while officials discussed incoming grain shipments from southern regions. Light entered through narrow windows and stretched across dusty floors. Clay seals rested beside baskets of rolled documents tied neatly with cord. One scribe paused briefly to stretch his stiff fingers. His work required endless concentration. Measurements. Names. Tax records. Storage calculations. Mistakes caused problems. So he copied each symbol carefully despite the heat building steadily inside the room. The Egyptian state depended heavily on written organization. Food reserves, labor assignments, temple offerings, and transportation schedules all required constant record keeping. Yet these systems were not abstract to ordinary people. They touched daily survival directly. If grain storage failed, hunger followed. If irrigation labor was poorly organized, crops suffered. If river transport slowed, supplies disappeared from markets. So even people far removed from royal power still relied upon the larger administrative structure continuing smoothly. This mutual dependence strengthened the kingdom over time. Near midday, sunlight turned harsh and white across the valley. The air shimmered above stone surfaces. Workers wrapped cloth around their heads while searching constantly for small patches of shade. The heat ruled the rhythm of Egypt. People adjusted themselves around it carefully. Labor slowed during the worst hours. Animals rested. Market activity softened. Even conversation often became quieter beneath the crushing afternoon sun. At a quarry site beyond the green edge of the river valley, stone workers chipped carefully at limestone blocks while dust floated thickly through the air. Their bodies glistened with sweat. Water carriers moved between groups with jars balanced carefully against their hips. The labor looked endless. Hammer. Lift. Pull. Rest. Repeat. Large construction projects in Egypt depended not on bursts of energy but on sustained human endurance over many years. Workers understood this instinctively. No one expected monuments to appear quickly. Everything important took time. Temples rose slowly. Canals expanded slowly. Tombs were carved slowly beneath desert cliffs. This patience protected Egypt from exhausting itself too suddenly. The civilization moved at a human pace because it had to. Near the royal tomb villages in the western desert, artisans worked carefully inside cool underground chambers painting scenes across plaster walls by flickering oil lamp light. The air smelled of mineral pigments, smoke, and damp stone. One artist painted river birds among papyrus reeds. Another outlined offerings placed before the dead. The work demanded steady hands and enormous patience. Mistakes were difficult to correct. Yet these artisans often spent years working on a single tomb complex. Their lives followed long stretches of careful repetitive effort. And again, Egypt's stability appeared through repetition rather than speed. Outside the tombs, the desert sun burned brightly across silent hills while guards rested beneath shaded shelters eating bread and onions during a short midday pause. Even here, in remote places far from crowded cities, the same rhythms governed life. Shared meals. Scheduled labor. Nighttime rest. Morning preparation. Routine connected distant regions together emotionally as much as politically. As afternoon slowly softened toward evening, relief spread quietly across the valley. Farmers finished work in the fields and washed dust from their hands in irrigation channels. Fishermen checked nets beside the river while birds schemed low over the water searching for food. Children ran through village streets again after hiding from the worst heat earlier in the day. Smoke rose from cooking fires. Goats returned toward enclosures. The smell of evening meals drifted through the warm air. These evening hours carried a deep feeling of release after the demands of labor. People sat outside homes beneath fading sunlight while speaking softly with neighbors. Some repaired tools. Others wove baskets or mended clothing by hand. Work never fully disappeared. But it became gentler at night. The Nile reflected the changing colors of the sky beautifully. Gold. Orange. Deep blue. Then finally black beneath the stars. At one riverside home, a family gathered for the evening meal around shared bowls of lentils, bread, and dried fish. The father rubbed aching muscles in his shoulders while listening to his children speak quietly about the day. A grandmother sat nearby weaving reed mats with slow practiced movements. The youngest child leaned sleepily against the wall while the oil lamp flickered softly beside them. Moments like this rarely appeared in official records. No monument described them. No royal inscription celebrated them. Yet these ordinary evenings formed the true foundation of Egyptian endurance. Families eating together. Workers resting together. Neighbors sharing stories beside the river after sunset. Civilization survived through human closeness as much as through power. And Egypt developed countless habits that encouraged continuity within communities. Late at night, when most lamps had burned low and villages became quiet once again, the river continued moving northward through the darkness exactly as it had for thousands of years. Boats drifted gently at their moorings. Palm leaves whispered in the breeze. Temple walls cooled slowly beneath moonlight. And across the sleeping land, the great system of Egypt remained alive not because it was unbreakable, but because every morning ordinary people woke again and chose, quietly and steadily, to continue living within its ancient rhythm. Before the sun returned to the valley, before the ovens warmed and before the first workers stepped onto dusty roads, Egypt rested beneath a deep and gentle silence. The Nile flowed through darkness with slow steady movement, reflecting pale stars that trembled softly across the water. Thin reeds bent in the cool breeze along the river banks. Far away, somewhere beyond the sleeping villages, a night bird called once and then fell quiet again. The air smelled of mud, water, smoke, and damp earth. Inside small homes built from clay and straw, families slept close together beneath light linen coverings. Some rested on woven reed mats laid directly on packed earth floors. Others slept on rooftops where cooler air drifted softly through the night. The heat of the day still lingered faintly inside the walls. Egypt was always warm. Even at night, the land seemed to hold the memory of the sun. In one village near the southern reaches of the Nile, a woman woke before everyone else in her household. She sat quietly for a few moments beside the doorway, listening to the sounds of darkness while rubbing tiredness from her eyes. Her body ached from the previous day. Hours spent grinding grain, carrying water, cooking beside hot ovens, washing clothing near the riverbank, watching children, repairing torn linen. The work of ordinary life never truly ended. Yet she rose calmly because the morning tasks were already waiting. Outside, the sky had begun turning slowly from black to deep blue. The village remained peaceful. A donkey shifted in its sleep nearby. Palm trees stood motionless against the horizon. And from the direction of the river came the quiet sound of water brushing against reeds. This rhythm had repeated for generations beyond counting. Wake before dawn. Prepare food. Walk to the fields. Repair tools. Return at sunset. Sleep beside family. The repetition itself created stability. People understood where they belonged inside the larger pattern of life. Children watched adults. Apprentices watched masters. Farmers watched the river. Knowledge moved slowly and steadily through time. That movement became one of Egypt's greatest strengths. Near the riverbank, fishermen prepared their boats in darkness lit only by small oil lamps hanging from wooden posts. Nets rested in damp coils at their feet while cool mist drifted above the water. One man checked each knot carefully with rough hands hardened by years of labor. Another repaired a torn section of net using thin cord and a bone needle. The work required patience. Fishing always required patience. The river could not be forced. People waited for the right currents, the right season, the right flood level. And over centuries, this patience shaped Egyptian thinking itself. The civilization rarely rushed. It adjusted slowly, built slowly, expanded slowly. And because of this, it often avoided the sudden violent collapses that destroyed kingdoms elsewhere. At dawn, the first sunlight spread across the valley in long pale bands. The river glowed softly beneath the morning sky. Birds rose from marsh reeds in sudden flapping clouds while farmers moved toward the fields carrying wooden tools across their shoulders. The coolness of early morning faded quickly. Already the air hinted at the heat to come. Still, the morning hours remained precious. Workers moved steadily while shadows were long and the ground still held traces of night moisture. Along irrigation canals, farmers inspected water flow with careful attention. Mud walls needed constant repair because water slowly weakened them day after day. Children sometimes helped carry baskets of soil while older workers packed fresh mud into cracks using bare hands. The canals were lifelines. Without them, the flood waters could not spread correctly across the fields. Without controlled irrigation, crops failed. Without crops, Egypt weakened quickly. So generation after generation maintained the waterways with endless quiet labor. Most people would never see their names carved into stone. No temple walls would celebrate them. Yet without their daily effort, the civilization itself could not survive. In larger towns farther north, workshops slowly opened as sunlight brightened the streets. Carpenters swept sawdust from work areas while potters uncovered clay left damp overnight beneath wet cloth. Metal workers lit small furnaces. Textile workers stretched linen across wooden frames. Stone carvers sharpened bronze tools worn down by constant use. The city filled gradually with familiar sounds. Hammering. Grinding. Animal carts rolling over stone. Voices calling softly through market streets. The noise was not chaotic. It moved with rhythm. Egyptian cities functioned almost like living machines powered by repetition and memory. People knew where goods arrived, where water could be collected, where grain was stored, where tools were repaired. This familiarity made urban life surprisingly stable even during periods of political uncertainty. When one ruler disappeared, the baker still opened a shop at dawn. The fishermen still carried nets to the river. The potter still shaped clay. Daily necessity continued pulling society forward. Inside a government grain storage complex near the docks, scribes worked carefully beside towering bins filled with harvested grain. Dust floated through warm shafts of light while laborers carried baskets in long steady lines. Each basket was measured, recorded, stored. The scribes dipped brushes into black ink and wrote numbers onto papyrus sheets with patient attention. Storage systems mattered enormously in Egypt. Good harvests could not simply disappear into private homes or local markets. Grain had to be collected, organized, protected from spoilage, and redistributed when needed. This careful planning helped Egypt survive poor flood years better than many neighboring lands. Preparation created resilience, and resilience prevented collapse. Outside, river boats unloaded cargo slowly onto crowded docks. Sailors shouted softly while tightening ropes and balancing heavy goods across narrow wooden planks. The smell of fish mixed with wet wood, mud, sweat, and smoke from nearby cooking fires. The Nile remained Egypt's great highway. Messages traveled upon it. Taxes traveled upon it. Stone blocks, grain shipments, livestock, soldiers, priests, craftsmen, and merchants all moved along its waters. The river connected distant regions so effectively that Egypt often functioned like one long stretched-out community instead of scattered isolated settlements. This connection mattered deeply during crises. Regions could support one another. Officials could move quickly. Food could travel where needed. The Nile carried not only water, but continuity itself. As midday approached, the valley grew bright and heavy beneath the crushing heat of the sun. Air shimmered above temple courtyards and stone roads. Workers covered their heads with linen cloth while animals searched desperately for shade. The body became impossible to ignore in Egyptian life. Everything depended on physical endurance. The strength to carry water. The strength to harvest grain. The strength to carve stone. The strength to row against river currents. People understood exhaustion intimately. At a quarry site in the desert hills, laborers rested briefly beneath rough shelters made from cloth and wood. Dust coated their skin pale white. Nearby, jars of water cooled beneath damp coverings while workers ate simple meals of bread and onions in tired silence. No one wasted energy speaking too much beneath the afternoon sun. The heat itself commanded respect. Even powerful rulers could not defeat it. And perhaps this constant reminder of nature's strength helped Egypt remain grounded in practical realities. Grand ambitions always had to survive the climate first. In temple gardens sheltered behind high walls, pools of water reflected lotus flowers while priests moved quietly through shaded walkways carrying incense and offerings. These sacred spaces often felt calm compared to the crowded noise of nearby cities. Temples represented continuity more than excitement. Rituals repeated daily. Songs repeated daily. Offerings repeated daily. Morning purification. Evening prayers. Seasonal festivals tied to the flood. The predictability of religious life reassured people during uncertain times. As long as the rituals continued, the world still felt ordered. This emotional stability strengthened society in ways difficult to measure. Late in the afternoon, sunlight softened at last. Long shadows stretched across fields and village paths while workers slowly began returning home. Children reappeared outdoors after hiding from the midday heat. The evening breeze arrived gently from the river. People relaxed. Conversations lengthened. Fishermen repaired nets beside the water while farmers washed mud from their legs and feet in irrigation channels. Nearby, women prepared evening meals as smoke rose lazily into the fading light. Bread baked again. Fish roasted over open flames. Lentils simmered slowly inside clay pots. The smells drifted warmly through the villages. Even after exhausting days, these evening hours carried comfort. Families gathered closely together. Stories were repeated. Neighbors shared news. Tools were repaired for tomorrow's work. The civilization renewed itself quietly every night through these small acts of community. At sunset, the Nile became beautiful beyond words. Golden light spread across the water. Palm trees darkened into silhouettes. Birds crossed the glowing sky in slow formations. For a few brief moments, even tired workers often paused to look. Then darkness returned gently to the valley once more. Oil lamps flickered behind windows. Dogs wandered quiet streets. Temple walls cooled beneath the stars. And all across Egypt, millions of ordinary people settled into sleep knowing that before dawn the same ancient rhythm would begin again beside the eternal river. The night rested softly over Egypt. Far above the river valley, the stars drifted slowly across the dark sky while the Nile moved beneath them with patient endless calm. Along the muddy banks, reeds whispered in the warm breeze. Boats tied beside wooden posts creaked gently against the current. Most villages had fallen silent hours earlier. Cooking fires were now only faint red glows beneath ash. Oil lamps flickered weakly behind small windows. Families slept closely together beneath the lingering warmth of the night air. And still the river flowed northward, carrying the life of the kingdom quietly through the darkness. In one small house near the edge of a farming village, a young boy woke briefly from sleep and listened to the sounds outside. He heard insects singing beside the water. Somewhere nearby, a donkey shifted softly in its enclosure. The smell of baked bread from the previous evening still lingered faintly inside the room. Soon his mother would rise. Soon the ovens would warm again. Soon sandals would scrape against dusty roads as workers walked toward the fields before sunrise. The rhythm never stopped for very long. And because it never stopped, Egypt continued surviving one generation after another. Long-lasting civilizations are often held together by ordinary mornings more than dramatic victories. As the eastern horizon slowly brightened, temple servants already moved through dark courtyards carrying small oil lamps toward sacred chambers hidden deep inside stone complexes. Their footsteps echoed softly against cool floors still untouched by sunlight. Priests washed carefully before dawn rituals. Water poured into stone basins. Incense smoke rose slowly into the air. Soft prayers drifted through shadowed halls painted with scenes of harvests, river journeys, birds, stars, and gods watching over the ordered world. The rituals rarely changed. And that constancy comforted people. When life feels uncertain, repeated actions become deeply reassuring. Egypt understood this very well. The same prayers. The same offerings. The same flood festivals. Year after year. Century after century. Even during periods of hardship, rituals reminded people that the larger rhythm of existence still continued. Outside the temples, dawn spread gently across the Nile Valley. Pale light touched the tops of palm trees while thin mist drifted low above the river. Farmers stepped onto narrow pathways carrying hoes, baskets, and wooden tools worn smooth by years of use. The morning air felt soft against tired skin. For a short while before the sun climbed higher, work felt easier. Birdsong filled the reeds near irrigation canals. Fish disturbed the water surface with quiet ripples. Oxen moved patiently beside farmers through damp fields where dark fertile soil still held traces of floodwater moisture. The river had once again left behind life. Black mud rich enough to feed entire communities. The Egyptians never forgot this gift. Every harvest reminded them that survival depended not only on labor, but on cooperation with the Nile itself. And because the river usually behaved predictably, Egyptian society learned predictability too. This became one of its greatest hidden strengths. Near a larger settlement farther north, Bakers worked beside glowing ovens while the city slowly awakened around them. Dough covered their hands and arms. Sweat already formed across their foreheads despite the early hour. The bakery smelled warm and heavy. Grain. Smoke. Hot clay. Fresh bread. Outside, buyers waited quietly with baskets tucked beneath their arms. Some were servants collecting food for wealthy households. Others were laborers purchasing simple morning meals before long hours of work. Bread united nearly every class in Egypt. So did exhaustion. Whether wealthy or poor, nearly everyone understood the physical weight of heat and labor. Even scribes sitting indoors bent over papyrus suffered aching backs, tired eyes, and cramped hands after long days of work. The environment touched everyone. The sun ruled everyone. And this shared physical reality helped create certain forms of social stability. People understood limits. Understood dependence. Understood routine. Inside the crowded docks along the Nile, sailors unloaded grain shipments from boats arriving during the night. Ropes strained against wooden poles. Sandals slipped on wet planks darkened by river water. Workers balanced baskets carefully while supervisors counted deliveries aloud. The docks were noisy but organized. Cargo moved constantly through Egypt. Stone from quarries. Fish from delta marshes. Papyrus bundles. Linen cloth. Beer jars. Wood imported from distant lands. The river carried the kingdom upon its back. Without it, Egypt would have fractured into isolated communities surrounded by desert. But the Nile connected distant regions into one continuous living system. And because communication remained possible, recovery remained possible too. A failed harvest in one region did not always mean total disaster. Supplies could travel. Labor could move. Officials could respond. The kingdom bent without immediately breaking. Near midday, sunlight became sharp and blinding across the valley. White stone temples reflected heat so strongly that the air itself seemed to shimmer. Workers wrapped cloth tightly around their heads while searching for shade wherever they could find it. At a canal repair site beside the fields, laborers stood knee-deep in mud reinforcing collapsing irrigation walls with woven reeds and packed soil. Water flowed slowly around their legs while insects gathered in the humid air. The work was unpleasant and exhausting. Yet everyone understood its importance. Without irrigation, Egypt weakened quickly. So even difficult labor carried a sense of shared necessity. Communities survived together or suffered together. This understanding helped maintain cooperation across long periods of time. An older worker resting briefly beneath a small shade shelter wiped sweat from his face and drank carefully from a clay water jar. Nearby, younger laborers continued hauling mud in baskets while joking softly to pass the time. Laughter still existed in Egypt. Quiet laughter. Tired laughter. Human moments between long hours of labor. Civilizations endure partly because people continue finding small comforts even during hardship. A cool breeze at sunset. Fresh bread after work. Conversation beside the river. Children sleeping safely nearby. These things matter deeply. In the workshops of skilled artisans, afternoon light filtered through roof openings onto half-finished carvings and painted walls. Stone dust floated through warm air while craftsmen worked with calm concentration. One carver shaped the feathers of a bird into limestone. Another polished a wooden chair meant for a wealthy official. Nearby, an apprentice carefully mixed pigments for wall paintings while trying not to waste precious materials. The work moved slowly because precision mattered more than speed. This patience appeared everywhere in Egyptian life. Slow farming. Slow construction. Slow administration. Slow adaptation. Modern minds might call such a pace inefficient. But slowness can create durability. Things built carefully often survive longer. And Egypt became one of history's great survivors. Late in the afternoon, the sun finally lowered toward the western desert. Relief spread quietly through the fields and cities alike. Workers straightened sore backs and looked toward the lengthening shadows with tired gratitude. The air softened. Birds gathered near the river. Children emerged from shaded homes to play beside village pathways. Even the animals seemed calmer. At the edge of the Nile, fishermen pulled in their final nets of the day while the water turned gold beneath the setting sun. Some catches were small. Others better. But tomorrow they would return again regardless. Routine mattered more than immediate success. One poor day did not destroy the system. The river still flowed. The flood would still come. The work would continue. As evening settled across the valley, cooking fires appeared one by one beside homes and courtyards. The smell of lentils, onions, roasted fish, and fresh bread drifted through the warm air while families gathered together after long days apart. In wealthier houses, servants poured cool water over guests' hands before meals. In poorer homes, families shared simple bowls while sitting close together on reed mats. Yet night offered rest to everyone. The darkness softened differences for a little while. Oil lamps glowed gently. Voices quieted. Bodies relaxed. An old woman sat outside her doorway weaving reeds into baskets while grandchildren leaned sleepily against her side. Nearby, her son repaired a broken wooden tool beneath fading light. No grand monument recorded these moments. No official inscription described them. But this was the true life of Egypt. Not only kings and temples, but ordinary people continuing ordinary routines day after day beside the river. And perhaps that was why the civilization endured so long. Because its deepest foundations were not built from glory. They were built from habit. From memory. From shared labor beneath the same relentless sun. From millions of people waking each morning and quietly continuing the work left to them by generations before. Late into the night, after the villages had gone still once more, the Nile continued its endless movement through the sleeping kingdom. Moonlight shimmered softly across the water. Palm trees rustled in the breeze. Temple towers stood silent against the stars. And somewhere in the darkness, another Egyptian child fell asleep listening to the gentle sound of the river that had carried his people through countless centuries without ever truly stopping. The night grows softer now over the Nile. The river still moves through the darkness with the same slow and patient rhythm it carried thousands of years ago. Water brushes quietly against the reeds. Palm trees sway gently in the warm night breeze. Far across the sleeping fields, a small oil lamp flickers faintly inside a mud brick home before finally fading into darkness. The workers have finished their labor. The ovens have cooled. The boats rest silently beside the shore. And Egypt, ancient and enduring, settles into another peaceful night beneath the stars. Somewhere along the riverbank, a fisherman sleeps beside folded nets still smelling of water and reeds. In another village, a farmer rests deeply after a long day beneath the sun, his hands still rough with dried mud from the fields. A child dreams quietly beside an open window where cool night air drifts through linen curtains. The temples stand silent now. Their stone walls hold the warmth of the day a little longer before surrendering slowly to the coolness of night. Painted halls and quiet courtyards rest beneath moonlight while distant insects sing softly near the water's edge. The great system of Egypt was never only about kings or monuments. It lived in slower things. In bread baked before dawn. In sandals crossing dusty roads. In the sound of grain being ground beside small household fires. In tired workers resting after sunset. In the river returning again and again without fail. And so Egypt endured not because it was unbreakable, but because life itself continued gently forward through ordinary people who carried memory, routine, and labor across countless generations. The Nile flows onward. The stars drift silently overhead. The desert remains watchful and still beyond the fertile valley. And the ancient world slowly grows quieter now. The voices fade. The lamps dim. The warm wind moves softly through the reeds one last time. And beside the eternal river, beneath the endless Egyptian sky, history finally rests.